My name is Sarah. I'm 32, a communications specialist in the city. People often think I have it all together, that I'm just one of those women who's always on top of things, working a successful job, living in a nice apartment, always so composed. But inside, things have been falling apart for a while now. It's funny, isn't it? Life has this way of catching you off guard, throwing things at you that you never expected. I've been through some pretty tough moments, but what happened recently has been beyond my comprehension. I don't think I ever imagined that I'd find myself telling a story like this, but here we are. It all started when my mother, who'd been battling cancer for months, passed away. The moment she was gone, I felt like my whole world had shattered. I'd been trying to hold it together for so long, but losing her, I just wasn't ready for it. And honestly, I don't think anyone could have been. But what made things even harder, something I'm still trying to wrap my head around, was how my sister Emily handled it. You see, Emily has always been different. We've never really gotten along, and lately I'd just been keeping my distance, trying to deal with my own life, my own grief. But Emily, she had her own agenda. What happened on the day of my mother's funeral? Well, that's something I never thought I'd have to explain to anyone. But I need to tell you. I need to make sense of it, for myself if nothing else. Growing up, my family dynamic was anything but normal. My parents' marriage ended when I was in high school, and while it was a relief to see them go their separate ways, it left a hole that never quite healed. My mom remarried quickly, and suddenly I had a new dad in the house. His name was Bill, and he was fine, I guess, but nothing compared to my real dad, who'd always been there for me. I didn't really bond with Bill, and I especially didn't bond with Emily, my half-sister. We were from different mothers, different fathers, different worlds. There were times when we'd share a laugh, but for the most part we lived parallel lives, with only the occasional awkward family dinner to bridge the gap between us. Emily and I were never close, not in the way I'd imagined sisters should be. She had this tendency to act entitled. Maybe it was because my mom always treated her like she was the fragile one, the one who needed to be taken care of. Emily would always complain about something, her job, her relationships, her life in general, while I was the one who held it together. I remember thinking, why does she get so much attention? Doesn't she know I'm struggling too? But my mom, despite everything, always had this soft spot for her. I often found myself falling into the background while Emily got all the praise, especially when it came to things like school or career choices. I was happy for her, but honestly, I resented the attention she'd get. I didn't expect her to be perfect, but Tommy, my son, always asked about her. He'd ask why we never hung out like the other families, and I'd give him an answer that I thought would make sense to a 6-year-old. Sometimes sisters are just different, honey. It's okay. But even Tommy could see it. He'd point out how Emily never came to his birthday parties or sent him birthday cards, and that stung a little more each time. I started to realize that Emily's lack of effort wasn't just a reflection of her, but of the whole family. It felt like they were more concerned about her than me. I tried not to let it bother me, though. After all, family was family, right? But then everything changed when my mom got sick. Mom was diagnosed with cancer, and it was a slow decline. I watched her, the woman who'd always been my rock, slowly fade away. The hospital visits became frequent, and the treatments drained her. But I stuck by her. I made sure she wasn't alone, held her hand, took her to appointments. In the midst of all that, I was juggling work, being a mother to Tommy, and trying to keep my own emotions in check. Emily, on the other hand, barely showed up. There were times when I called her, begging her to come visit, but the excuses never stopped. "I'm busy," she'd say. "I can't make it today, maybe next week." Week after week, it was the same story. It hurt, but by then I was used to it. I remember one night, when Tommy was staying with my mom while I had to go to a late work meeting, Emily finally called me. Her voice was full of excitement. "I've got something big to tell you," she said, as though it was the most important thing in the world. I had barely any energy for small talk, but I listened. "I'm getting engaged," she said, her voice practically vibrating with joy. I could almost hear the ring sparkling through the phone. "Oh, that's great, Emily," I said, trying to sound happy, even though I could feel the bitterness starting to creep up my throat. "You'll be happy together." But in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. My mother was dying, but all Emily seemed to care about was this engagement. Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to cause trouble. Not yet. As the weeks passed, things got worse. My mom's condition took a turn for the worse, and we were told there was nothing more they could do. The doctors gave us a timeline, but it still didn't feel real. I spent every waking hour with her, holding her hand, talking to her, telling her everything would be okay. Even when I knew it wouldn't be. Tommy, at only 8 years old, tried his best to understand, but how do you explain to a child that his grandma won't be around much longer? And then came the final blow. Emily called again one day, but this time her tone was different. "So, the date for the engagement party is set," she said. "It's going to be huge. You'll come, right?" I could feel my heart sink. "When is it?" I asked, trying to hold back my emotions. "The weekend after Mom passes," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My mind was racing. I could hardly catch my breath. "The weekend after Mom passes." I had to repeat it in my head a few times to make sure I had heard her right, but there it was, clear as day. Emily had scheduled her engagement party on the same weekend as my mother's funeral. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman who'd never bothered to be there for our mom, the one who always seemed so wrapped up in her own life, was now planning a celebration of her own. On the very day I would be burying the woman who gave her life. The audacity of it made my blood run cold. But that wasn't the worst part. No. The worst part came a few days later when I was sitting by my mom's bedside. Emily came to visit for the first time in over a week. She was wearing a brand new dress, her engagement ring sparkling on her finger as though she were preparing for a royal coronation. She sat beside me, her eyes full of excitement, and told me about the party in great detail. "I've invited everyone. It's going to be so fun," she gushed. "I can't wait for everyone to see the new venue, and, it's just going to be amazing. I'm so happy." I just stared at her. I couldn't speak for a moment, my thoughts swirling in disbelief. How could she be so excited when we were living through a tragedy? "I hope you'll be there," she continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "It's the perfect time for all of us to celebrate. You shouldn't be sad for too long, Her voice was light, carefree. I had to bite my tongue to keep from yelling at her. "You want me to come to a party when Mom is dying, when we're preparing to bury her? Emily, I can't even wrap my head around this. How can you be so selfish?" But Emily just shrugged. "Well, that's life, isn't it? You can't just sit around and cry forever. You need to move on." Move on. Move on? In that moment, I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. How could someone so cold, so heartless, be so casually dismissive of the pain I was going through? My mother, the woman who had been there for both of us, was on the brink of death, and here Emily was, planning a party, acting as if it was the most normal thing in the world. It felt like a slap in the face. "Emily," I said, barely able to control my voice, "you're planning this engagement party on the same day as Mom's funeral. Don't you think that's a little inappropriate?" She just stared at me for a moment, unblinking before answering. "I don't see why I should cancel it. You're just being dramatic. Besides, it's just a funeral. She's not going to care." Just a funeral. The words stung like nothing else. I felt my blood boil, my vision blur with anger and pain. How could she be so heartless? How could she think that her engagement, her happiness, was more important than our mother's memory? I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave before I said something I would regret. I walked out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, and went outside to clear my mind, but all I could think about was how everything had led to this moment. This terrible, cruel moment when I realized that my family, especially my sister, had no respect for me or for what I was going through. It was no longer just about Mom's death. It was about the complete and utter betrayal by the people who should have been there for me. And that's when I knew I would never be the same after this. The day Mom passed, I barely slept. The entire night was a blur of hospital calls, making funeral arrangements, and holding on to hope that she'd hang on a little longer. But by the time morning came, it was over. She was gone. I sat by her side, holding her hand, wishing that somehow, in some way, I could have done more. But I couldn't. No amount of love could bring her back. The silence in the room was deafening, and it hit me harder than I ever could have imagined. I remember looking down at Tommy, my little boy, who was still so innocent, so unaware of the depth of loss that was flooding my heart. I hugged him tight, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had to be strong for him. He deserved to know his grandma's love, even if it was just for a short time. But as I started preparing myself for the funeral, my mind kept drifting back to Emily. I kept wondering how she would respond. Would she show up? Would she finally realize how wrong it was to prioritize a party over a mother's funeral? The morning of the funeral, my phone rang. It was Emily, of course. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to pick up, but I did. "Hey, Sarah," Emily said, her voice light and almost too cheerful. "I just wanted to remind you about the engagement party. I really hope you can make it after the funeral. I know it's been a tough time, but it's going to be such a good time, and I'd love for you to be there." My heart sank. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I could hardly keep my emotions in check. "Emily, are you seriously asking me to come to your engagement party after burying Mom?" I could feel the anger rising in me. Emily laughed a little, completely unaware of the gravity of the situation. "You know, we all have to move on at some point. Life keeps going, and I just think it'd be nice if we could all be there to celebrate together, right?" I didn't know how much more of this I could take. I wanted to scream at her, to demand she understand what was happening, but instead I said quietly, "I don't think you get it. This isn't about you and your party. It's about the fact that our mother is gone. It's about respect. But I guess you don't understand respect." I hung up before she could respond, but as soon as I did, I felt like a part of me had died. I couldn't believe that after everything, Emily was still more concerned with herself than with the family she claimed to care about. When the funeral service started, my heart was heavy with grief, but at the same time, I felt a strange numbness. How could anyone look at this day, this moment of pain, and think it was appropriate to plan a celebration, to throw a party while we buried our mother? The people who showed up for the funeral were sympathetic, but there was no comfort in their words. Nothing anyone could say would bring back the woman who had raised me, who had taught me everything I knew. Tommy clung to me the entire time, and I had to pretend everything was okay for his sake. I could feel the sting of tears, but I refused to let them fall in front of him. When the time came for us to go to the gravesite, Emily and Mom's side of the family still hadn't arrived. I was standing by the open grave, staring at the casket and trying to keep my composure when I got the text. It was from Emily. She had sent a photo of her engagement ring, proudly showing it off. The text underneath read, "It's time for a new chapter, right? Don't forget, party starts at 6. My hands were shaking as I looked at the text, a sickening wave of disbelief washing over me. How could she be so oblivious, so cold? How could she truly believe that this day of all days was meant to be about her? I tried to stay composed for the rest of the service, but the pain was unbearable. When the service ended and I looked around, I saw my mom's side of the family. My aunts, uncles, cousins, looking at me, some of them with pity, some with confusion. The rest of them seemed completely unaware of what was happening. Some even whispered about Emily's engagement party and how excited she was. And then, the moment I'd been dreading came. My mom's husband, Bill, and Emily's father arrived. They both looked uncomfortable in their black suits, like they had no idea how to handle the situation. Bill gave me a quick hug and muttered, "Sorry for your loss," but his eyes were already darting toward the parking lot. I could tell he was just itching to leave. Emily's face was nowhere to be seen. I didn't know whether to feel anger or just numbness, but I felt both at once. I thought back to everything, how Emily always had her way, how she manipulated our family, how my mother had always defended her. But now, on the most important day of my life, she wasn't here. Instead, she was preparing for a celebration that felt like an insult to everything we had just lost. And when the time came to leave, I wasn't even sure what I was leaving for. I didn't know if I was more upset about the funeral or the fact that I'd just witnessed my sister act like nothing had happened. I tried to keep my focus on the people who did show up, but in that moment I knew something had shifted. Something had broken inside me. The family I thought I had no longer existed. The sister I thought I knew was gone, and I wasn't sure how to fix any of it. I didn't even feel like going to the reception after the funeral. The idea of walking into a party, surrounded by fake smiles and empty chatter, was too much to bear. So I made the decision to head home, alone, with Tommy by my side, and my heart broken into 1,000 pieces. But I wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. And that's when I decided I had to do something about it. The next few days passed in a haze. I went through the motions. Work, meetings, errands, anything to distract me from the fact that I had just buried my mother and that my family had, in the cruelest way possible, chosen to ignore my grief in favor of a celebration of their own. I couldn't get Emily's words out of my head. It's just a funeral. She's dead anyway. It doesn't matter to her when she goes in the ground. Those words were etched in my brain, repeating over and over again. And it wasn't just Emily. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. How had my mother allowed Emily to behave like this for so long? How had Bill, who I had always thought was a decent guy, stood by while all this happened? I realized that maybe it wasn't just Emily. It was the whole damn family. They had all let me down. They had allowed Emily to become this entitled, selfish person, and now they were all pretending like nothing had happened. I kept trying to reach out, but every conversation seemed more and more strained. Emily texted me a few days after the funeral, apologizing in a message that barely seemed genuine. "I know it was hard for you, Sarah, but you have to admit it was a beautiful day for all of us. I'm just so happy, and I wanted to share that happiness with you. Please don't hold it against me." That was the moment I knew. There was no coming back from this. She didn't get it. She never would. And I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when it was so obviously not. I couldn't understand how my own sister could treat me this way. After everything I had done for the family, after all the sacrifices I had made for them, especially during Mom's illness, this was how I was repaid, with indifference, with coldness. It hurt more than I could ever explain. A few days later, I made my decision. I called my mom's lawyer and made sure that all the property, including the house that had once belonged to Mom, was officially transferred to me. That house had so many memories, both of good times and bad, but it was still something that had been my mom's, and now it was mine. Emily had already shown she had no interest in preserving the family legacy. She'd made that clear with her actions. Then, I did something I never thought I would. I cut them all off. I stopped all the monthly transfers I'd been sending for years. You see, even though I had never asked for anything in return, I had been financially supporting my mom and Emily for so long, paying for bills, sending money for their needs, even fixing things around the house when they couldn't afford to do it. I realized I'd been enabling them to take advantage of me, to pretend like nothing was wrong. It was time to stop. I also started distancing myself from the rest of the family, including Bill. I couldn't bear the thought of pretending like we were still one big happy family. It was all a lie, and I wasn't going to be part of it anymore. I didn't want to hear from them, didn't want to be reminded of the betrayal, the hurt. If they couldn't be there for me in my time of need, then I couldn't be there for them anymore. But the final straw came when I saw Emily's post on social media. She'd posted pictures from her engagement party, the one that had occurred on the same day as our mother's funeral, and she'd written this long, glowing caption about how life is all about celebrating the good times. It was like a slap in the face. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I decided to make it clear to everyone what had really happened. I shared my side of the story, the truth about what Emily had done. I wasn't going to let her paint me as the villain, not after everything she had done. I didn't care if people judged me. At this point, I didn't care about the backlash. I needed to stand up for myself, for Tommy, for Mom, for the family that had ignored me. As I posted the truth, I felt this weight lift off my shoulders. Finally, I wasn't keeping this inside anymore. The whole world would know what kind of person Emily really was, and I felt this strange sense of peace, knowing that I had done the right thing. Of course, Emily didn't take it well. She lashed out at me, claiming I was being unreasonable and selfish, but by then I was done listening. I wasn't going to waste my time defending myself to someone who had no respect for me. But that wasn't the end of it. No, things were about to get worse. The days after my post went live were a whirlwind. At first I felt relieved, but that relief quickly turned into something else. Emily, of course, was furious. She flooded my inbox with angry messages, calling me everything from selfish to vindictive. But it wasn't just Emily. My phone started blowing up with messages from family members, and not the ones I thought would have my back. They were angry at me for sharing my side of the story so publicly. "Sarah, this isn't the way to handle things," my aunt wrote. "You should have kept this private, not aired dirty laundry on social media. This could ruin Emily's life." My cousin Dave called me the next day, his tone cold and judgmental. "You're burning bridges here, Sarah. This is family. You don't do this kind of thing over a party." I couldn't believe it. Here they were, coming to Emily's defense, but no one was willing to stand by me. No one seemed to care that Emily had desecrated the most important day of my life, our mother's funeral, just to throw a party. Instead, they were all focused on the fact that I'd exposed her for what she was. And then came the real shock. My mother's lawyer called me a week later. He had some bad news. Apparently, Emily had been in contact with him, trying to reverse the legal papers that I had signed, trying to get her hands on the house that had belonged to Mom. I was livid. This was a move that completely crossed the line. I had told Emily in no uncertain terms that the house was mine, that it would stay in my possession. But now she was actively trying to tear apart the legal document. I immediately called my lawyer and told him to make sure the papers were locked down. No matter what Emily tried, she would never get her hands on that house. But then something else happened. I received an email that took me completely by surprise. It was from Bill. He was writing to me to apologize for the way things had unfolded, but the apology felt hollow. He had no right to apologize for Emily's actions, and yet there he was, trying to play the hero, telling me that it wasn't Emily's fault, that she was just young and confused, and that I shouldn't have cut ties with her. His words were so empty they felt like an insult. Bill had never understood me, never understood how much I had done for that family, how much I had sacrificed to keep things together. Now he was trying to manipulate me into reconciling with Emily. I didn't reply to his email. I didn't need to. A few days later, I got a call from my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. She sounded panicked. "Sarah, there's someone at your grandmother's house. Someone's been breaking the windows. It looks like they're throwing rocks at the place. You need to come over here." I felt a surge of dread. I knew exactly who it was. I immediately contacted the police. When they arrived, I was there too, standing on the sidewalk, watching as they confronted Emily, who was caught red-handed. She was the one smashing the windows of the house. My mother's house, the house I had worked so hard to protect. When I saw her standing there, her face twisted with anger, the fury that had been boiling inside me finally erupted. I walked up to her, my voice cold and steady, and I said, "You have no right to be here, Emily." No. Her expression faltered for just a moment, but then she rallied. "You think you can stop me?" she sneered. "You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" I didn't respond. The police were already confiscating the rocks and noting down the damage. When I showed them the legal documents proving I was the rightful owner, they stepped in, escorting Emily off the property. I could hear her yelling behind me, but I didn't care. It was over. When I got home that night, I felt this strange calm wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't upset. I was finally free. I knew that I had done everything I could to protect what was mine, to stand up for myself and for Tommy. But that night, after everything had settled, I received another message. This time, it wasn't from Emily, or Bill, or even anyone from my extended family. It was from a cousin I hadn't heard from in years, Sarah, my cousin from my mom's side. She simply said, "You did the right thing, Sarah. We all knew what happened, and you don't owe them anything." In that moment, I realized that, despite everything, I was not alone. There were people who saw what Emily had done, who recognized the truth. And even though it felt like I'd lost everything, I realized that I had finally gained something more important. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the people who had wronged me. I thought of Tommy, my precious son, who had been through so much. I knew I was doing this for him, too. He deserved to see his mother strong. And I would be strong, no matter what. I didn't regret a thing. Months passed. It's strange how time works. It can either feel like it's dragging on, or it can slip through your fingers when you least expect it. For me, it was a mix of both. I was slowly healing from everything that had happened: my mother's death, Emily's betrayal, the destruction of our family. But it wasn't easy. I attended therapy every week, sitting across from Dr. Andrews, who had been helping me piece my life back together. I was learning to live without the constant guilt that had weighed me down for years, and I was learning to let go of the toxic people who had been a part of my life for so long. Dr. Andrews always said that healing doesn't happen overnight, that it's a slow, painful process. It wasn't just the loss of my mother that hurt. It was the loss of everything I thought I knew about family. The first time I went back to my mom's grave without the overwhelming grief, I stood there for a while, staring at the stone. I told her that I loved her, that I was trying to move on. I promised her that I wouldn't let the actions of others control my happiness anymore. It wasn't easy to forgive myself for letting Emily and my mother's side of the family hurt me so deeply, but the more I reflected on it, the more I realized that forgiveness isn't about letting people back into your life who don't deserve it. It's about finding peace within yourself. I had to forgive myself for allowing the toxic relationships to thrive for so long. I had to accept that sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the most. I found peace in knowing that I had made the right decision. Sometimes family doesn't deserve your loyalty, and that's a hard truth to accept. But Tommy had taught me a lesson I would carry with me forever. True love is unconditional, and when you experience loss, you realize that the people who truly matter are the ones who are there, not just when it's convenient, but when it really counts. I thought about Emily, and while I didn't wish her ill, I knew that the bridges had burned and some things can't be fixed. I couldn't change her, and I couldn't change my family, but what I could change was me. I could move forward, knowing that the people who really mattered, the ones who truly loved me, were the ones who had my back. And that was enough. As for Emily, I knew she'd keep living her life as she always had. But I was done trying to fix something that was beyond repair. Tommy's laughter filled the room as he played with his toys in the corner. I smiled, watching him, feeling grateful for the love we shared. My heart wasn't broken anymore. It was healing, piece by piece, and that was more than enough for me.